Thank you so much for joining me for another worm video. It is week 3 of the update on my newly restarted worm bin. And as you can see, the rectangle design there shows where the worms have really been hanging out and eating and leaving the castings. So I have a good area where they're moving around. They are definitely breaking down the material. And there are times when I look at the castings when my bin's just started and think, wow, these worms are really going to finish up this bin really quickly. But then I have to remember that there is barely any material in this bin. So I will be adding more material to this bin to ensure, once again, that when it is time to harvest the castings, that I have a good bit of castings to go ahead and harvest. When you look at my regular totes, you'll notice that the walls of the bin don't show any evidence of worms crawling around. If you're unsure what that means, when the worms are unhappy with their environment and trying to escape, you'll see worm trails of their castings left along the walls. Or you'll find that when you open the bin that they will be at the top of the bin in the lid and trying to escape. If that happens, you just kind of have to figure out what is it that is making them unhappy with the bedding that they currently have. For the last couple of cycles, I have eliminated the issue with them traveling. I used to have a really big problem with that. There isn't a trick to it. It's just kind of learning what your worms need. Since the worms did break down the castings pretty good this week, I gave them an extremely large feeding for what they are normally accustomed to. I always like to see how that affects the bin, as well as if the worms are going to break it down. But once they got their feeding and they get their grit, I did add another layer of bedding to this bin, a thin layer, mostly because I ran out of material that was pre-shredded. But I did add another layer to this bin before closing it up for the week. Again, very happy with what I'm seeing here for just week 3, and that will conclude the update for this particular bin for the week. The second regular tote that I have is the regular tote that tends to run a bit wetter than its sister bin. Now in this bin, the rectangle where the worms have been active is much larger than the activity sized rectangle from the other bin. And I have to wonder if that's attributed to the dampness of this bin. I find that the damper the bin, the happier the worms, but I'm unhappy with how wet they are because I don't want to put my hands in a really mushy bin. But there's a lot of activity, and I have an unexpected early worm ball in this bin, which is always cool to find when they're gathered around something. And since I do have an issue with the second regular tote running wetter despite being in the same place, I did get a very good viewer suggestion of feeding the bin larger pieces to see if that affects the moisture content in the bin any differently than giving it the smaller pieces that are wetter. So what I'm going to start doing over the next few weeks is feeding this bin only larger chunks than what I'm feeding the other bins. I just so happened to do it this week before the suggestion was made, where I gave this bin larger size pieces. So when I do the review and update for next week, we'll see if anything changed with how this bin looked from week to week with getting the larger pieces. I also note that I think I have more worms in this one because this bin was more broken down than the sister bin as well too. So I gave this one, just like the other one, a layer of cardboard and cocoa core. I want to see if giving the cocoa core and the cardboard reduces how much material gets recycled back into the bin after I've gotten down to the finished bedding that I am going to harvest. And I thought I had forgotten the worm chow in with the food, so I put a layer on this one. That's the only reason, but as I go back and look at this video, I see that I did put the worm chow in, so it wasn't any special reason other than I forgot. But that completes the update for this bin for the week. Moving over to the first of the Vermibag totes. Now this Vermibag tote was harvested at the same time as the regular totes were harvested, so it's on its week 3 after a new harvest, and the area where the worms are active is smaller in this one, and that's to be expected because there's more surface area where the worms are exposed to the air, so they kind of go inward to go to the damper areas in the bin, and that's why I fluff the bin a lot to mix in those drier edges that you will get with a Vermibag tote. These totes are awesome for me in the summertime because I do have high humidity in my area in the summer. I'm zone 6B, I'm in New Jersey, very, very humid. But in the wintertime, they tend to dry a bit more. So I'm going to watch out for dryness because the Vermibag tote is the bin where the colony collapsed. Before I had my channel, I had a total colony collapse, and that was in a tote over the winter. So I think not paying attention to the level of moisture in this bin attributed to that. I'm going to give this one also a good size feeding for this week just to see how the worms deal with this. This bin doesn't look like it has as much activity as the regular totes have had. And again, it could be due to the limited area that they're restricted to that it looks like right now. But I'm going to add some more material to this one and cover it up. And this bin will be all set for the next week as well. Moving over to the second of my Vermibag totes. This is the tote where I have been making my focus growing the colony size. And there is a small area right in that pocket that I just moved where you can see the worm activity. Since this colony is so small, again, I got another great tip from 2 of my viewers who suggested doing worm breeder bins. I had heard about worm breeder bins on another channel, but thought it was more detailed than something that I could handle at the time. When I looked it up, I think that this is going to be a good solution for me to try to grow this particular bin. So in the upcoming weeks, you're going to see me shift my focus from just trying to grow this bin to trying to grow this bin by using a breeder bin in conjunction with it. Despite the low numbers, this colony is doing really well. So this week I gave it a little bit bigger feeding in the hopes that they would break this down as well, because they've been doing a good job of breaking down the material in the bin. I'm not finding really large portions left over. And then, like I said, in the coming weeks, I'm going to detail what I plan to do with this particular bin. I'm not going to harvest the bin as I had planned before to not harvest. I'm going to continue with not harvesting the bin itself. I'm just going to shift a little bit and handle how I'm going to deal with the bin differently. But that is to come in a few weeks. I'm going to leave the paper in this bin just in case there's any juveniles or cocoons in there, and then close this up, and this is updated for the next week. So last and final is the Vermibag Mini, and this bin is doing really well. You can see that with the Vermibag Mini, because there is so much area that is exposed to airflow, the edges of the Vermibag Mini are drier. But putting the food along the edges, the wetter material, last week I put the cantaloupe along the edges of the bin. The edges aren't as crispy as they usually are. I'm trying to make sure that I pull up the edges a bit. I don't really pull up from the bottom, but I try to pull up the edges a bit so that they get exposed to the wetter material I'm putting in. And after a few weeks now, the apples are finally mushy. So I'm going to leave the apples in because even though they look like they're firm, they really are mushy on the inside and the worms are getting in there. I still see those beetles, and they really do bother me, but I'm gonna not mess with them because they're not overtaking and competing with the food sources with the worms. But if I see in a couple of weeks that they're exploding, I'm definitely going to take measures to combat them. But right now, there isn't much for me to worry about with them. After I've done the same thing with putting more material or wetter material along the edges, and since the apples I kind of moved to the interior, I did put some more bedding into this bin. I am also trying to see if adding the cocoa core reduces how much of that crumbly material and material that needs to be recycled go through the bin. So when it comes time to harvest this, we'll see if that does make an impact. And just for the added layer of protection, I put a little more worm grit at the top and then closed up the bin for the week. If you've gotten to the end, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Please like and subscribe. And as always, thank you so much for watching.